Did you know knitters can't agree on what to call all of these? I mean, they're all yarn. We can agree on that much at least. And yet, when I recently started doing some research to figure out what exactly each of these things are called, I found that there are a lot of these units of yarn that have two or three or even four different names, and that different groups of knitters will use different names to refer to the same thing, or they'll use the same name to refer to two different things. Confused yet? Don't worry, we'll clear some things up. Welcome back to the Apiary and Knitting Podcast. My name is Lauren, and I am a knitting pattern designer with a special focus on accessories, especially socks. But I will also design shawls and hats and gloves and scarves and whatever else gives me joy, except garments because those give me a headache. In today's episode of the Apiary, we are talking about knitting vocabulary, and specifically all of the different names that we have for the different ways, the different units, the different shapes that yarn is sold in. Now, before we dig too deeply into this topic, I want to emphasize that one of the cool things about language is the way that it's constantly evolving and changing. And so a word may have one meaning at one time and a different meaning at a different time or in a different place. We can see this in writing across time, where the word awful used to mean awe-inspiring and now it means terrible. And we can also see this in different places where, for example, here in the US, the word bonnet might refer to something you wear on your head. And in the UK, the word bonnet might refer to the thing in the front of your car that you lift up to access the engine. This doesn't necessarily mean that one use of those words is correct and another is incorrect, because language is ultimately about communication. And as long as the speaker and the hearer, or the writer and the reader, both understand what the word is meant to mean, we've done our job of communicating. The same is true in the fiber arts world, with one very notable exception. In the fiber arts world, we have what are commonly known as heritage fiber arts or heritage crafts. These are very specific subsets of fiber arts that are often very closely linked to place, to culture, to community. And in those contexts, I'm always going to defer to the people from that place and culture and community when they say what words they want used to describe their heritage fiber art. Now, for the rest of us who are just joyfully crashing along with yarn and needles or yarn and hook or whatever else gives us joy when we're crafting, that's kind of a different story, right? Because we're just learning and playing as we go. And the words that we use in that context sometimes change meaning, again, depending on time and place. So let's take a look at a specific subcategory of knitting vocabulary that I had honestly expected to be very straightforward. I sat down a couple weeks ago to write a blog post about what's called yarn put up, and that's the different shapes that the yarn is sold in. As I was finishing the blog post, I wanted to do a double check to make sure that I had correctly identified the shape of the thing that I know of as a skein. And then I opened a can of worms. My first stop when I'm trying to address knitting questions is to do a quick Google and to see what other knitters have said about this topic. I've been around the knitting world long enough that I generally know whose opinion I really respect and who I've never heard of before. That doesn't mean I don't respect their opinion. It just means that I need to take a closer look at who they are and what their basis is for saying what they're saying. And when I started doing my Googling, I realized that some sources I really respected didn't agree on whether a hank was a skein or a skein was a hank. And then I did more Googling and I found other blog posts where people didn't agree on what was a ball. I even found one blog post that said skein is just a general descriptor for a unit of yarn. And so a ball could be a skein and a hank could be a skein and a cake of yarn could be a skein. At that point I decided, I'm done trusting internet sources. So I pulled out two heavy hitters. I got out this guy and I got out this beastie. And I went into the indexes and I started looking at, okay, how do they describe a skein? Guess what? They disagree. That's right. My two knitting Bibles, my trusty go-to forever ever guides, disagree on what a skein is. So the Principles of Knitting is, as you can see, an absolutely massive tome. It is full of teeny tiny writing and lots of diagrams and lots of information. This is an incredibly dense, helpful book. And the author of it, June Hemmons Hyatt, says in this book that a skein is a hank, and both of them are a circle of yarn that has been twisted up on itself. Like this guy. Vogue Knitting's Ultimate Knitting Book is also a pretty well-respected source, and it is also pretty serious. It's got lots of diagrams, lots of teeny tiny writing. Again, they're not skimping with the information here. Vogue Knitting's The Ultimate Knitting Book says this is only a hank, not a skein. And a skein is either this guy or this guy. At that point, I was pretty delighted because I had discovered a situation in the knitting world where there was no clear answer. And I love when there's no clear answer. So I made a post on Instagram and I got lots of interesting comments from people. I heard from some friends who are dyers who said that in their heads, in their world, when they talk about a hank is this thing in its untwisted form, when it's just a big circle of lots and lots of yarn. And once it's twisted up, it becomes a skein. I also heard from some other people who said they would never call this thing a skein, but to them, this is a ball. And I even saw some sources saying, yeah, you can call this a ball, but you could also call it a donut. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through all of the different shapes of yarn that I have sitting on my desk, and I'm going to tell you all of the different names I have seen for that shape of yarn and which name I see used most commonly for that shape of yarn. Okay, ready? Let's go. We're going to start with the simplest one. Pretty much everybody agrees that this is a ball. I have not seen anybody calling this by any other name. This is a ball of yarn that I wound by hand from and untwisted this, which we'll come to in a minute. So I untwisted this, wound it up, and turned it into this. And everybody seems to agree this is a ball. So at least we have one thing that we completely agree on. This is a ball of yarn. What about this thing right here? Most people call this a cake. Some people will also call it a ball. And part of that is because the tool that is used to make it is sometimes known as a ball winder and sometimes called a yarn winder. Again, this is made from taking a twisted up one of these, untwisting it, and winding up the yarn. But you use a tool for this. So you can either use a handheld tool that's kind of like a stick that you wrap the yarn around, or I use a yarn winder. Yarn winders come in different forms. This is what mine looks like. Mine is a belt-driven yarn winder. So you see there's a belt here between the crank, where I crank it with my hands like so, and then this is where the yarn gets wound up. So you secure the yarn in this little notch here on the tip of it, and it spins around and around and around and around, and it winds it up into this little shape here. There are also yarn winders that clip onto a table and that are driven by gears instead. So you're still hand cranking it, but you're hand cranking it most frequently with those ones where your hand is perpendicular to the floor instead of parallel to the floor, as with my yarn winder. Okay, so that's shape of yarn number 2, commonly known as a cake, sometimes also called a ball. Shape of yarn number 3, again, commonly known by one name, sometimes known by another. I usually see this shape described as a ball. This is a factory wound ball. So this is the shape that the yarn is sold in. But sometimes people call it a donut because of that little hole in the middle, which is kind of a cute name for it. All right, now we're getting into slightly trickier areas of naming yarn shapes. You'll have to forgive this one. This has been frogged and rewound, but this was a unit of Karen yarn at one point. And I would call this a skein. This is what I would know as a skein. And I haven't seen too many other people describing this particular shape as anything other than a skein. Where we start getting a little confusion, though, is with the other things that are also sometimes known as skeins, such as this guy. Now, I would call this a skein. My knitting vocabulary tends to line up more closely with the Vogue knitting book than with the Principles of Knitting, but we'll get there in a moment. Other knitters I have seen refer to this as a ball or an oval ball or an elongated ball. Part of that is also going to depend on what their native language is, because sometimes other languages will refer to this shape as something else, and then when it gets translated into English, it picks up a name or a different name depending on how they've translated that shape. And now we get to the trickiest yarn shape of them all. It's this fella right here. Some people call this a hank. Some people call this a skein. Some people have very strong opinions about whether it's one or the other. I think as long as you're clear about what it is you're talking about, it doesn't really matter what you call it. But the clarity is important, because if you are telling someone how to knit from a skein of yarn and you don't clarify whether you mean this kind of skein or this kind of skein, you might have a situation developing, because you can knit directly from this thing. You can just pull the yarn out of the edge and away you go. You cannot knit directly from this one. This one requires some prep work before you can work with it. You have to untwist it, put the circle of yarn on either somebody else's forearms or 2 chairs or a yarn swift, and then wind it up into either a ball or a cake so that it's usable. If you try to knit directly from this shape of yarn, you are going to have a terrible tangle and you will hate your life. So why does yarn get sold in so many different shapes? Well, there are a few reasons, some practical and some aesthetic. In terms of shipping, hanks ship very easily. Yeah, I tipped my hand for you there. I tend to call these hanks in specific conversation when I want to be very clear about what it is I'm talking about. When I'm talking about this and not this, I will call it a hank. When I'm not needing to be clear, I'll call it a skein sometimes. So hanks are very easy to ship. Why? Because they're relatively compact, they're flat, and they stack easily. That means they're also easy to display because, again, you can stack them. You can have like a row on the bottom and then another row on top and another row on top, and you don't really have to worry about them rolling away. That's a little more challenging with a ball, for example. A ball is not as dense. You can see how much squish I get there versus out of this guy. This is much more densely packed. This has a lot of air in it. And this will roll away more easily. So if you're trying to stack it on a table for a display, that's going to be challenging. But But if you have a yarn with some subtle variegation that you really want to show off, and maybe the hank isn't showing it off that well, but a ball does, you might want to go for the ball. Same thing with this type of skein. You can see this yarn has some really subtle color variation in it that maybe wouldn't be quite so visible because of the length of the striping in it. And so maybe this particular shape shows off the color to more advantage. Again, this shape is also easier to stack and display than this shape as well. Though again, this one is still quite light and fluffy, very squishy. You can see I get a lot of squish out of there, but less squishy than this one. And again, part of that is because they're different yarns too. I'm not using the same yarn in every single one of these. But this shape tends to be somewhat squishy. This one tends to be very squishy. This one tends to be a little more densely packed. You are almost never going to see yarn sold in shops in these two shapes. Why not? Because the process of winding the yarn into a ball or a cake tends to put some strain on the yarn. There is some tension involved in the winding process. Let me show you what I mean. So when I'm winding yarn with my yarn winder, it feeds through this little loop here first, which gives it a little tension there. It tugs on the yarn a little bit because the yarn is coming off of my yarn swift. It's expanded out onto this round umbrella thing that spins like this. And then as I spin this, the yarn gets pulled onto here and tightened around the stick into a ball. Now, that is very nice for making the yarn usable, but the added tension can be damaging, especially for really delicate fibers. So if, for example, you were using a 100% cashmere yarn, I would be super careful to not wind that yarn up until I was ready to use it. That's also why if you have a lot of yarn sitting in your storage at home, I really recommend that you don't change the form it's in compared to how the manufacturer packaged and sold it until you're ready to use it. So if you have a lot of hanks sitting in your desk at home or your closet or your dresser, wherever it is you keep your yarn, I recommend keeping it in the hank form until you're ready to work with the yarn. Again, remember, part of communication is just making sure that you, the communicator, and the person receiving your communication both have the same understanding of the meaning of the words that you're using. If you know that the word you're using might be ambiguous, you can take proactive steps to cut off that ambiguity by making it very clear what you're talking about. So if, for example, I was writing a blog post or doing a YouTube video on how to knit from a skein of yarn, and I wanted to make it very clear that I meant this type of skein of yarn, I might describe it carefully. I would say the type of skein of yarn that is a large loop of yarn twisted around itself with one end tucked into another, so that knitters and readers would know that I don't mean this type of skein of yarn. This is definitely not an exhaustive list because I can't travel all over the world and talk to every knitter in the world. But if you have other names for any of these forms of yarns that you use that I haven't covered yet, I would love to hear about them in the comments below. And if you've had any miscommunications or confusions that came about as a result of knitters using the same name for two different shapes of yarn or using two different names for the same shape of yarn, I'd love to hear about that too. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next episode. Happy stitching!